Hey guys, in this video we're going to prevent the player spawning with two weapons in hand, and we're going to discover why we have a problem with the way that we were specifying the dominant hand, and we're going to specify the dominant hand a different way. We're also going to be writing some error checking code for the first time. So here in the player we're going to be using this assert. So this is pretty cool. We're gonna make a request dominant hand, and we're gonna find it by type, and then we're gonna use assert to give the designer feedback about what they need to be doing in terms of adding scripts to characters. So I'll see you in there. Let's keep progressing our player. So here, back over in Rick's scene, we see that the player still has a hoe in his hand without the game running. So what's going on there? Well, of course, Rick has made some changes to the player, and those changes are shown here in bold, and they weren't applied back to the prefab. Now, let's not blame Rick, because actually prefabs are a pain when it comes to this. Let's think about what actually happens when you click this apply button up here. We can use source control to help us. So what happens is you're making a change on the instance here, and that is a change inside the scene file. So for example, if I change move turn speed to 900, half of its previous value. If I then save the project and go and have a look and ask my source control system, hey, what's changed? I may need to save the scene as well. Actually, it is specifically the scene I need to save. So I save the scene, I go back to source control and say, hey, what's changed? And provided that you've got in your edit project settings editor force text asset serialization turned on, then you will be able to see what's changed. Now, a few things have changed here, but the thing that's of interest is somewhere, it's difficult to see, here you go, this is the value. On that particular thing in the scene, the value has changed from 1800 down to 900. I'm going to pop it back to 1800 again, so that we remember Rick's values. Now, if I was to click apply, which I won't do now, then what that would do is it would copy all that data from the scene file over into the player prefab file, and because it's a copy, that's where we get issues. So there are potential solutions to this. There's all sorts of things on the web. I believe you can do a search for poor man's nested prefabs. There you go. And there's a solution on framebunker.com there that you could take a look at, and there's a script you could copy. All of these things are a little bit complicated and add a little bit of overhead, so I'm going to resist them for now and just focus on being conscious of what we're doing. So firstly, I need to go through the components of the player in Rick's scene, this player instance, and make sure I extract the value of from everything, and not the transform. I don't care where it is, but is there anything different in the animator from this instance to the prefab? No. Rigid body? No, nothing's in bold. Capsule collider? Nothing's in bold. Third person character? Copy the component, go to the player, and paste component values. Boom. Okay, let's go back to the instance in Rick's scene. I can close that one down now. Nav mesh agent, yep, it's got a difference. So I'll, in a disciplined way, copy the component, paste the component values. It's useful how they've got the same things opened over here. That's pretty cool. Makes it very easy to go through and do this. We only need to do this when we forget to apply a prefab. And then the final one is the player script over to the player and paste. All right. So I have now pushed all of the changes that Rick made on the player back, well, I say that we made on the player's top level object. There's possibly some changes on the lower level objects, but they're all just transforms if you look through, so that's fine. Okay, I'm not too worried. Just have a quick look at the skin mesh renderer. Okay, cool. So all good. Now that we've done that, now that we've extracted Rick's value from there, we can now revert the player to the prefab position. There you go. All right, so this guy now, when we spawn him, let's see what happens. Here he goes, and he spawns into the scene, but the variable weapon socket of player has not been assigned, it's saying now. What's that about? Well, remember on the player, we exposed this weapon socket, and we looked for a game object, and that game object was Ethan's hand. But now, we can't find Ethan's hand. Why is that? Well, the most likely cause of that is that we tried to connect a prefab to an instance. What I mean by that is over in the showcase scene, when we clicked on this player and we said, hey, weapon socket, and we went and found the hand, rather than finding it here from the list of prefabs, what we did is we scrolled into the player, we went and found the player instance's hand and dragged that. Now that is dragging an instance to a prefab. And if you look at the best practices for Unity, and I've got a copy of it here, but you can just look for 50 best practices for Unity. We've talked about this document before. Then somewhere in here, it says don't drag instances to where is it? Let me just see if okay, link item 44, link prefabs to prefabs. Do not link instances to instances. We also shouldn't link instances to prefabs. All right, so that rule there, I'm going to grey it out just to say, well, we've covered that rule. I'm trying to cover all of these rules during this course if at all possible. So this document, by the way, is a journey, not a destination. There's a huge amount of complexity in here. Let's try and get through it bit by bit. I suggest you don't try and come to our Google Doc because it's going to change, but that you just go to the original blog, which you can look for 50 Unity tips you can look for. All right, look for the 2016 version. Anyway, that's what we did. We took an piece of instance data and dragged it to a prefab, and that's caused us a problem. So we need to think about a whole new way of tagging the weapon hand, and we're going to learn a little bit about error management as we do it. So how are we going to tag this hand? Let's go find the hand in an instance again. We're going to go for the shoulder left, upper arm, lower arm, hand. Okay. Now we could use a tag potentially. And I've also made a note to myself that Rick is asking me a question here. Ben, do we need? I've put that on my plan. Remember, you should have a plan for the next couple of weeks as to what you'll be doing, and I've put that in here, okay? So we could use a tag potentially, but there's a problem with that. It's string referenced. In the code, when you want to try and find a tag, you have to type a string. I hate string referencing. So we want something that is compiler time checked and that we can refactor and rename easily because naming is so important. So the only way to, well, not the only way, but a good way to do that would be to add a component. Now, unfortunately, that component needs to be a full mono behavior. Otherwise, it won't have, you won't be able to find the component, add it to the game object, find it by, find the component in script, and then go ahead and find the hand game object. We need to be able to do all that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that we use a mono behavior to tag the weapon hand, which is sounds drastic, but I think that that's a reasonable way of doing it here. We may add behavior to that later, we may not. So let's see how that would be done. We go to the weapon left hand in this case. We add a new script called, I'm going to call it dominant hand. And that dominant hand script, let's organize it immediately. It's to do with characters, actually, not weapons. And I don't think I need this test scene while I see it. The moment you see things that need cleaning up, by the way, you should just clean them up. Yeah, I don't think I need that test scene, so let's get rid of that. Let's pop into weapons. I noticed something else. Hoe grip. I've spelt hoe grip wrong. How grip. That's something else I saw earlier. Okay, cool. So now in the characters folder, we have a dominant hand script. Now let's go into that dominant hand script. It could do with some explanation. It's incredible. It's going to have nothing in it, basically, for the moment. But we're going to use it as a strong means of finding the right thing at runtime. So let's get rid of all this stuff. And let's just put a clear comment here that says, add to dominant hand on player, well, on character prefab. Okay. And that's it. That's all it does for the moment. Dominanthand.cs. Cool. So with this dominanthand.cs, we can then, for the last time, drill into the player, go and find their hand. There it is. Which actually, I'm in a test scene here. Doesn't matter, provided I immediately apply this back to the prefab. So pop it in the hand, apply this back to the prefab. Let's pop into a different scene, like, say, Showcase, not saving the test scene as we go. We don't need the test scene. So there in Showcase, let's just check now that the player has in his left hand this dominant hand script. Oops, if I go down the right part of his body, get there eventually, left hand. There you go, it's actually got 2. So let's apply that to the prefab. Just going to check by popping a new character into the world that the character is what we want. Player, have a little look at it, scroll in, armature, hips, spine. Getting bored of doing this, but this should be the last time. Dominant hand, there you go. Okay, cool. So the prefab now has a dominant hand script on it. What next? Well, what we need to do next is when the player does all this stuff that he does, one of the things it does is it just assumes that there's a weapon socket available, and it's this weapon socket up here that is causing us a problem. Let's get rid of the weapon socket altogether in the player class. The member variable weapon socket, this line up here, line 15 in my class, which is game object weapon socket. Let's get rid of that altogether. And then where we put the weapon in the hand, we're going to need to go and find that weapon socket. Now I could use the same name. I could say game object weapon socket equals, and I'm going to call this request dominant hand, like that. Why request? Because the designer may not have actually specified a dominant hand. So let's go ahead and implement this method, and we'll talk a little bit about error handling as we do this. So we're going to have a request dominant hand method. All right. Now weapon socket, I don't really like the name of that now. I'm going to call it dominant hand. Just do a quick refactor there. So you instantiate the weapon into the dominant hand, and we refactor out the behavior that requests the dominant hand. So how are we going to find out what this dominant hand is? Well, firstly, if we made ourselves a variable called dominant hands, and we used the search get components in children of type. Now, what's the type of the thing? Well, it was called dominant hand, like so. Then what do we get back from this? Well, we're going to get an array of components. There you go. We should be getting an array of dominant hands. Okay, but we're only potentially getting an array of dominant hands. We're not definitely getting an array of dominant hands, because what happens, like right now, when right now there is a script, but let's say we took the script off the left hand again for a second. It pains me to do that. If I play the game, what happens? The requested feature is not implemented. That's because it's got here. Okay, that's good. I really like those exceptions that get thrown like that. But the point is, if we were to print at this point dominant hands with no script attached, what are we going to get? Well, let's take a look what we get. We get the nice requested feature is not implemented. We also get an empty. Oh, right, it doesn't actually tell us how long it is, so let's go find out. We should get an empty array, pretty obviously. That's what I'm trying to get across, is that there are no dominant hands on this player right now. 0. Okay, there are 0 dominant hands on the player. So that is a problem. What we want to do is make sure we know how to handle the case when there is 0 and the case when there are more than 1 dominant hands. And we need to tell the designer and stop the execution and explain what's going on. So I could come in and say int number of dominant hands equals, this is a very simple line just to document a little bit, dot length, like so. Now we can say assert. We haven't used asserts before, but let's see what they do. If you import a new namespace at the top called using Unity Engine dot assertions, like so, then we can say right here, now normally you don't mix error checking and logic, but in this case I think it's quite clear that what we need to do is say, handle 0 hands, handle 1 hand, you get the idea, and then handle greater than 1 hand. And it will be a very simple 5-line method when we've finished. So what we're going to say is assert dot, now we've got a variety of things we can do, and we can say are not equal, and we can say number of dominant hands is not equal to 0. And if it is, now it's nice and self-documenting, you want to say no dominant hand found. Well, that's actually spell it like this, dominant. Now you could take this out as a variable potentially, but no dominant hand found on player, please add 1. So there's the error and the solution at the same time. Now, even though we're not actually implementing this request dominant hand, let's see what happens. Let's see if we're better than we were before. We try playing the game with no dominant hand on the player. No dominant hand found on player, please add 1. Ah, cool. So we go to the left hand, we add a dominant hand, and we play the game. What happens now? Ah, okay, we just get a not implemented exception. That's okay, because we haven't finished implementing. Now, what's the next thing that can go wrong? The next thing that can go wrong is that we have more than 1 dominant hand. So assert is false. Number of dominant hands, comma, not comma, is greater than 1. Now, 1 is okay in code. It's not a magic number quite. 2 and above I consider a magic number. But if there's more than 1 dominant hand, then we want to say something like more than 1 dominant, or multiple is clearer, isn't it? Multiple dominant hand scripts on player. Please remove 1. See how nice this is, because it's self-documenting as well. The final, well, let's try this actually before we go on. We don't need to implement the actual behavior. This is like test-driven development. We keep failing, but working our way towards it. So requested features not implemented. How about if we try to make his left foot a dominant hand, for example? What would that do? It's anywhere on the player, so that get components in children will find it. Dominant hand, multiple dominant hand scripts on player, please remove 1. Ah, okay, cool. So you have to go through looking for it, but this is really, really handy for the designer, right? Cool, so now all we need to do is get rid of the throw not implemented exception, knowing that this is a logically complete set. The only thing left out of this set is less than 0, Well, we're not going to end up with less than 0. You could, if you wanted to, you could say less than or equal to. You could say is false if you really wanted to be complete. And then you could say less than or equal to 0 there. And that would be fine as well. So we can do that if you like, if that makes you happy. Makes me slightly happy. Now we know that the only thing left in here, given that this number of dominant hands is an integer, which I've specified there, is 1, so that we know if we get down to here, we have only one dominant hand, in which case we can just go and say dominant hands 0, element 0 of the dominant hands, dot game object, that's the thing we want, and that's what we want to return. So what I'm saying is that we take the 0th element of dominant hand array, which is just this script here, and we find the game object, which is one of the reasons it had to be a mono behavior. So that's it. So this request dominant hand method really reads quite nicely now. And I like that. In fact, the player is generally looking all right. I don't like this on mouse click. I'm going to put myself a to-do, refactor to simplify, or to reduce number of lines. Okay, so I don't like that. That needs to be tidier. Everything else in here is kind of looking all right. So hopefully that makes sense, how we've done this request dominant hand. Let's just make sure it works. No errors, and he has a weapon in his hand. Cool. Now, finally, we want to move over to Rick's scene. Skibbity-beep-bitty, skibbity-beep-bitty. Saving mine as I go, and play the game. And what happens? Ah, he has a rod in his hand. Fantastic. And if I go and drill into the player, and just check that I can switch the rod out for, say, a hoe, that is working nicely. Awesome. So hopefully that makes sense. We've learned something about error detection and correction as well. Nice new piece of code there for you. This is basically what we wrote. And of course, we also made a little bit of a change. Well, we just made this very thin dominant hand class. And don't be afraid to do that sometimes. It's a very strong way of tagging because we can actually rename this dominant hand to donkey if we want. And everywhere that should work. Well, not quite everywhere, because now in Unity, when you rename a class, then the script name doesn't change. So you'd have to rename that and change the script name. So it won't quite work in one step, but it'll nearly work in one step. And at that point, we are in good shape. So better just make sure it still works, because I made a quick rename to that script. It does. That's it, and I'll see you in the next video.